welcome back to 316, a Bible study at Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason, and I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway. And on behalf of our church, welcome. We are excited to be connecting with you. For our regulars, if you'll give us a thumbs up, we're thrilled that you're there. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, do so. What are you waiting for? You'll get our Sunday services coming straight to you, as well as these studies. And if you're new with us, we'd love to have you subscribe as well. That way you're able to get our Sunday services as well as the studies that we do. Now, the reason that we call it 316 is coming from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. We're reminded that all scripture is useful. Some translations say profitable. But for teaching, correcting, rebuking, training in righteousness, we gather so much from His Word, and we're equipped. We're equipped to do all that God has called us to do, and so that's why we call this study 316. And so far we have been in a study of the Gospel of Mark, and we find ourselves in this particular study in part 8. We're actually going to end up having 11 total parts in this study. We had thought that it would be 10, but we're going to take it one more into the 11th, and I'll explain that at the very end of this particular talk. But we find ourselves in chapter 12 through 13, and we've done kind of some recap. We've dealt with introduction as to the context of the Gospel of Mark. Love to have you look back on those, but we're just going to go ahead and jump straight into Mark chapter 12, and we're going to kind of take our time through this. I had really dialogued and thought about doing chapter 12 and 13. Some of our studies we've done one chapter at a time, some we've done two at a time, and it's not that I had a robust quantity from chapter 12 that I wanted to dialogue. We're certainly going to have our fill, no question about it. But chapter 13, where it's a counterpart, its kind of brother in other Gospels would be Matthew 24 and 25. Jesus is talking about end times, and I thought Mark chapter 13, it needs its own talk. I just can't go through Mark 13 and 12 at the same time. So for this study, we're just going to go through Mark chapter 12, and it's in the final week of Jesus' ministry, final week of his life. Imagine that Jerusalem is just filling up with people. It's Passover week. Lots of people of all Jewish backgrounds are coming into Jerusalem, not just people from Israel, Jews who lived abroad outside of even Israel were traveling into Israel. If you lived in Africa, if you lived in Asia Minor, if you lived abroad in further territories, Arabia, and you were Jewish, you were coming to Jerusalem for Passover. And you think about the attention and the excitement and the pressure that would have been with that. Now, just to kind of give a parallel, think about what happens in our nation around an election year, a presidential election year. Things get very tense. There's pressure. There's heightened emotions. There's difference of opinions. There's sometimes arguing. There's excitement. It's a variety of things. As it gets closer, the month of, the week of, it's just like a fever pitch, and then the day of, it's like a fever pitch. Passover was like that, maybe even far higher for the Jewish people. And in it, in chapter 12, Jesus is going to be dealing with multiple confrontations. He's going to deal with multiple confrontations where one after another he's going to deal with a different group of opposition, and you'll see that as we go. Mark chapter 12 is beginning with a parable, and we'll read and I'll give some thoughts. It says, "He then began to speak to them in parables." Pause. So the word parable coming from a compound of a Greek term meaning to lay alongside of. So you would have something that you wanted to teach or tell, a truth, and then you would lay something alongside of it, a story, a metaphor. So he's going to tell a story that's going to lay alongside of something. You will see that what he's doing is he's taking this story and he's laying it alongside of Israel's history. The point is Israel's history. The parable is pointing to that. Okay, so he says a man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers, went away on a journey. At harvest time, they sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. Wanted the vineyard to be fruitful, so he goes to collect some of the fruit. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then the landowner sent another servant to them. The people that he had put in charge of this vineyard struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. So this whole parable is going to keep developing in this way. Landowner, vineyard, prepared it, dug it out, made it ready, put some people in charge, wanted it to be fruitful, sent some people to gather and gain this fruit, but they got mistreated, sends another person, gets mistreated again, and this is going on. Once again, Israel's history and a parable laying alongside of it. Now pause here. And we're going to keep going in a second, but I want you to think about Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1 through 7. So it tells us this in Isaiah chapter 5, and I'm going to read the 7 verses. This is prophesying of the parable of the vineyard. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up, cleared it of stones, planted it with the choicest of vines. Built a watchtower in it, cut out a wine press as well. Sounds like our parable, right? Jesus is pointing to Isaiah, but Isaiah is pointing to the history of Israel. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes. Once again, he wanted fruit. He looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. Now, this statement from Isaiah is a prophecy about Israel. The parable is going alongside of Israel and their history, as to that the landowner sent workers to inspect, to gain fruit, and this is going to point to its profits, but they got mistreated along the way. You'll see some of that in Psalm 80 as well. But he sent back to Mark 12, he sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. Once again, this is laying alongside of Israel's history, how the prophets were treated when they came to the religious heads and said, we've got to repent, we've got to bear the fruit that God honors. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, they will respect my son. But the tenants said to one another, this is the heir, come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. So he's going to answer some questions off this parable. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And now he is entirely out of the parable. And he says, haven't you read this scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So he has given a parable alongside of not only Israel, but Israel's history, how the prophets were treated, and that the father thought, well, surely I'll send my son and they'll treat him well, but they've mistreated my son. And so there's going to be ramifications that come to them because the son is the stone the builders have rejected, and he has become the capstone. The religious leaders are privy to how this would have been interpreted. So their Passover week in Jerusalem at the temple, massive buzz of people around. Jesus is teaching this. It's incredibly embarrassing because there would have been real easy to detect kind of how this is playing out. And then it says of these guys, these religious folks, then they looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. So you have this scenario, it's last week, all kinds of tension, and they're going to be going after, religious leaders are going to be going after Jesus, and Jesus is ready to deal with them one right after another. If you've ever seen a movie where you have this hero who's fighting everybody, he's fighting this guy, knocks him down. No, somebody else comes, he's fighting him, knocks him down. Somebody else comes, fighting him, knocking him down. That's Mark chapter 12. He's going to deal with one right after the other. So the next group that's going to come against him, it says, still in this last week, it says in verse 13, later they sent, being religious leaders, sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. Now pause. Let me kind of talk about this real quick before we read too far. So when it says here, Herodians, so that is coming from King Herod. But remember, King Herod has died. And you'll remember, you've seen it multiple times in our previous studies, the line work of Herod's sons. You had Herod Antipas, you had Herod Philip, you had Herod Tetrarch. The Herodians were Jewish people who were in support originally of King Herod. Now, King Herod was highly dysfunctional. King Herod is the one that issues the decree that every male child 2 years and under be killed in the time of Jesus' birth. He brought tremendous destruction to the Jewish people. So you say, why did some Jewish people support Herod and the paying of taxes that Herod instituted? Well, they did so because of the infrastructure that Herod built. Herod completely was an architectural builder. He had lots of building projects. He's the one that renovated the temple. You're going to see it in a little bit. He built a vast amount of things in that territory. He's the one that built Masada. He's the one that built numerous things that became very important for Israel and the Jewish people. So there were some Jews that supported him, even though he was crazy. They supported his expansion projects. Now here's what you got to know. The Pharisees hated the Herodians. Not disliked, they hated them. They were arch enemies because they did not want to give a dime to Herod. They did not want to give anything to him that supported his face on the temple. They hated the Herodians. So they hate Jesus more. So they're going to conspire with the Herodians around the very topic that the Herodians had the kind of despising componentry: money, taxes. So it says here, later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know you're a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with truth." All that's fluff. Just disregard all that. All that's fluff. Here's the question. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? The Pharisees would say absolutely not. The Herodians would have said absolutely. They're conspiring together because they want to pit Jesus into trouble. If Jesus says yes, it completely supports the Herodians' efforts with all the people that were supporters of Jesus. If he says no, then in Passover week, it appears like he is not a supporter of Roman taxation. So this is the dilemma that they're trying to catch Jesus in. Should we pay or shouldn't we? But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. He looks at them and he's going to take them right down. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought the coin. He already knows what it looks like. He's doing this for impact and effect. Whose portrait is on this and whose inscription? He already knew. A denarius wasn't new to Jesus. Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give it to Caesar. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. That word amazed is not coming from like, oh, impressed. It's coming like, we didn't get him, and we dare not go again. They didn't. So, you see, their hypocrisy is completely dismantled, and the Pharisees were willing to partner with whoever could dismantle or they thought could trap Jesus. So what happens in verse 18 is another group is going to try and trap Jesus. Then the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to him with a question. So let's talk about them. Okay, so the Sadducees were the ones that led and ruled in the temple. Think about this. So the temple had to be in congruence with Roman authority, and it had to be in congruence with Pharisees and teachers of the law. They had to be able to play both sides. So let me just kind of frame it like this. Have you ever watched politically how somebody who's a conservative and somebody who's a liberal, if they're kind of marginally conservative, marginally liberal, they can get along, they can talk, no problems. They might not see eye to eye, but they can work in the middle. But you have extreme conservative, like super, super extreme, and super, super extreme liberal. It's like those two can't get along. It's like they are just arch enemies of one another, and it's just tension, tension, tension. That would have been Pharisees, and that would have been Herodians. Extreme sides, just oil and water. Sadducees had to play the middle. And they were able to play the middle in a couple of ways. They believed in the law of Moses, first 5 books of the Bible. The Sadducees did not believe in the prophets. They did not hold the word of the prophets as being scripture. They only held to the words of Moses. First 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. They did not believe in eternal things. They did not believe in angels. They did not believe in the afterlife. And you think, these are the people running the temple? Yeah, because they were middle ground. And they were of economic affluence. They had, call it, some economic power to them. And so it's important to keep in mind that they don't hold to resurrection, and they only hold to Moses' writings, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, because that shows up in what happens next. So they're going to come and try and trap Jesus. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and have children for his brother. Now, they're going to propose a scenario. Because in the law of Moses, there was protections against deceased family members for their spouses. So it was all about protection, but we're not unpacking that. In verse 20, they're going to give some scenario. Random, make-believe kind of scenario. So let's say there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. And then it goes, the second one married the widow, but he also died, leaving no child. And it was the same with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. So this is all just fictional story for them. They're kind of proposing a theory. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be since the 7 were married to her? Please keep in mind, they're asking a question that they do not believe. They do not believe in resurrection. So if Jesus says there's no resurrection, well, that eliminates an entire community of Jewish people that hold to the truth of afterlife and eternity. If he gets in trying to answer this question, they're going to try and argue the lunacy or the how ridiculous the answer might be. So watch Jesus' response. Are you not in error because you do not know the scriptures? Love, love, love that. He comes so strong against them, and says, you don't know the scriptures. They thought they knew the scriptures. They thought they knew Moses' words. He says, you don't know Moses' words or the power of God. He says, when the dead rise, they'll neither marry nor be given in marriage. They'll be like angels in heaven. They're not going to be angels. We are not going to be angels. He says, we will be like the angels. We won't procreate. We won't have the same needs that we have in humanity in heaven. And he says, now, about the dead rising. Love this. Have you not read in the book of Moses? There's such irony of that. That's all they studied. Have you not read in your own material? Have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the bush, how God said to him, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, Isaac, and the God of Jacob. It is one of the most pressing, definitive statements in the Torah. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He goes to square one, Moses 101, and he says, you don't even understand Moses 101. Did not God say, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken. Love that. Talk about a mic drop. So he's answered the Pharisees and the Herodians. He's answered the Sadducees. So next up comes a teacher of the law. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given a good answer, he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? Now let's pause there. So you and I know of the 10 commandments. We also know in Moses' law there were 613 responsibilities. Those were called commands. There were inside of the commands what were considered the heavier commands and the lighter commands, the greater commands and the lesser commands, all commandments from God. But what were the highest commandments? What were the weightiest commandments? There certainly was in Jewish culture a distinction of weightier commands than lesser commands. But inside of that, 613 of them. And some of them were of things to do and things to avoid. On one side, commands that you do something. On the other side, commands that you don't do something. Let's say, for instance, honor the Sabbath. That's a do. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. That's a don't. Honor your father and mother. That's a do. Don't commit murder. That's a don't. So there was separation between these, okay? The most important one he answered, he doesn't get into answering the way the question is framed. So he says, the most important one, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. So he's answering with what's called the Shema Israel. So let me show you that. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 starts off, hear, O Israel. The word hear, not H-E-R-E, but H-E-A-R, to hear, was the Hebrew word Shema, and it meant to listen, but also to obey. You only listen to obey. Hear, listen, obey, Israel. The Lord our God is one, the Lord is God. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad is what it would be in Hebrew. And then it would carry on to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength. And then it would be talking about how you're going to carry this out and you're going to extend this to your family and press this upon your children. You bind the commands of God upon your forehead and upon your thinking. You talk about it when you're walking on the road, when you're lying down. And so the Shema Israel was something that the Jewish people would have prayed multiple times every day. Every single day they would pray the Shema Israel. And so Jesus points back to what was the most common. But then he adds this. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Now, love your neighbor as yourself appears to be like a random statement in Leviticus 19, verse 18. So let me just kind of ramble here for a second. You have Genesis, Exodus, then Leviticus, then Numbers, Deuteronomy. Exodus, the temple, the tabernacle had been completed, presence of the Lord on the tabernacle. And then it says in Leviticus chapter 1, God is calling Moses, and he's going to raise the concept of, if you're going to bring me a korban. Korban was the Hebrew word for offering. If you're going to bring me an offering, here's how it's going to go. And all of Leviticus is given to Moses in 1 month. You know that because it's dated in chapter 1 up in the first verse. And then you see in Numbers chapter 1 when that is. It's a 1 month window that Moses is given Leviticus about here's how you give offerings. And then inside of that, there's some laws. And they're about to go into the promised land. Now we know in Numbers 13, they're going to derail because, we see giants and all that. But they were headed towards promised land. And so all through Leviticus, God is continuing to say, when you go into the land, here's how you have to behave. When you go into the land and you take possession of different parts, here's how you are to live. Think about this. In Exodus, the entirety of Israel together, when they go into promised land, they're going to scatter. And what is going to be the central way of how we live? What is going to be the central way of how we worship? What is going to keep us from acting differently than other pagan nations? His word, his law. And so repeatedly, he's giving the law in the book of Leviticus on how they're going to orient with one another, how they're to handle dietary things, how they're to handle one another. And you get this one section where he is dealing with how they treat foreigners. As you go into new land, you're going to have aliens, you're going to have foreigners amongst you. Here's how you treat one another. And then in chapter 19, he's going to cover a variety of various laws. Here's how you should treat one another. Here's how you should handle yourself. Here's how these things have to happen. And he says in verse 18, love your neighbor as yourself. When you go into the land and you disperse, what will be this guidepost as to how you orient? It'll not just be command you do and command you don't. There's this overarching, along with love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor. Take care of one another. And so inside of that, coming back now to Mark, this teacher of the law says, well said. You're right in saying that God is one and there's no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. So this teacher of the law who understands Leviticus 1,000x to what I do says you're right. Of the totality of it all, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor. It's more important than all the burnt offerings that would have come at the beginning of Leviticus, and more important than all the sacrifices that would follow. And to that, Jesus is going to say, when he saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you're not far from the kingdom of God. You came to trap me, but you're closer than you think if you could not just know it, but live it. Somehow it's got to get from here to your heart. And from then, no one dared ask him any more questions. Like they were like, nah, he's knocking us down one right after the other. Yeah, I'm not going to take that on anymore. So then there's something interesting that happens, I think. In verse 35, it says, while Jesus was teaching in the temple courts. Now, let's talk about this for a second. Because once again, final week of Jesus' ministry, he's in Jerusalem. He's dealing with these folks in the temple courts. And he is going to be addressing all the teachers of the law, and he's going to be talking to them about honoring God and about teaching and helping people and whatnot. But then there's going to be this real interesting thing that happens. Something simple. I love the dichotomy of this. He's been taking down the ones that have the preeminence. The Sadducees, an expert in the law, even the Herodians and the Pharisees. And then he's going to deal with somebody who is just so absolutely overlooked. You would think that Jesus wouldn't have ever even seen this person, but you know Jesus. He sees the despondent, he sees the weak. But I want to show you something about the temple courts before I show you this story. So if I come over here and show you this rendering of what Herod's temple is proposed to have looked like. So let's talk about this. This is a rendering as to what they suppose the second temple looked like with Herod's modifications. Once again, Solomon had built the original temple. Then you have captivity. You have the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem. You jump into the era of Ezra and this return to Jerusalem and Haggai and the rebuilding of the second temple, and then later you have Herod, who puts a lot of money into to something I've called it a third temple. It's not a third temple; it's just a grand modification of the second temple and made it something grand. In the Jewish Mishnah, I believe it was in the Mishnah, but it's certainly in their historical records, that they said that if you had not seen Herod's temple, you had not seen a fine building. It was just impressive. So let's talk about what you see. You see where there would be a woman's courtyard where women were able to come. They weren't able to go in towards where the priest courtyards were, where sacrifices would have happened. They certainly wouldn't have been able to go into the holy place. Only the priests would have been, the high priests would have been going into the holy place. But you see the Gentiles' courtyard. It's close to my image, where my video. There would have been this wall. So Paul will talk about he has torn down the dividing wall. He'll talk about that. I think it's in Galatians. He's torn down the dividing wall. That would have been the Gentile wall that kept the Gentiles from the Jews. And he's talking about that we have been made one in Christ. But there would have been a Gentiles courtyard. Where you have Solomon's portico, you would have all these pillars and these, this open kind of leisure lounge area that wrapped all the way around. You can't see it in this photo, but that would have wrapped all the way around. And within Solomon's portico and a couple of different places within courtyards, this whole property sat on 35 acres. For Bridgeway owns 22 acres. The whole Temple Mount was up on 35 acres. It was incredibly large. And that holy place would have extended 90 feet above the Temple Mount, which was estimated at like 1,500 feet by 1,000 feet. It was a monster. But back to the portico and a couple different places, there were 13. I've read that there were 13 what were called agape boxes. They were giving boxes. If you go to a church, you have giving locations. Churches used to pass plates. Some still do. Some churches like ours will have things on the wall. We didn't start off that way. We used to pass plates too. Following COVID, we went to just stuff on the wall, and it has worked well for us. That's what was in the temple, were agape boxes where people could come and give an offering to the Lord. And it should have had some discretion about it, some silence about it. If you were bringing coins, you would want to be humble about it and silent about it. But some people came with a braggadocious spirit in how they would pour coins into the agape boxes, hoping that it just echoed out. Where people would be like, wow, he's given a lot. And there would be this false kind of pride. So in the book of Matthew, Jesus, similar to how Jesus said, hey, when you're giving, don't let your right hand know what the left hand is giving. Like, be humble about your giving. Well, that brings us all the way back here to the book of Mark. And we have here, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put. He sits off of where one of the agape boxes was and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. So there's a volume to it. There's a sound to this. One after another lined up. But a poor widow came, and whether or not she came to the one that they came to or whether she went to another one, you've got to imagine that all 13 would have had in the Passover as people are bringing their offerings, because people didn't give every single week the way we do, in a context where you would travel with your offering at the pilgrimage feast many times. Jewish Passover, they're bringing a big portion of their annual offering, and there's quite a display to this. This isn't just that the woman only had 2 fractions of coins to give that week. She only had this to give at Passover, where there would have been a tremendous amount of your whole annual offering. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, the poor widows put more into the treasury than all the others. I mean, that's amazing. That Jesus has taken down the Herodians, he's taken down the Sadducees who ran the temple. He's taken down the experts, like the who's who amongst teachers of the law. He's taken down the bigwigs, the people that the women wouldn't have ever got even to have a conversation with, that servants wouldn't have even got to have a conversation with. The who's who came attacking him, and he's taking them down one by one, and he stops and he watches this widow and he says, that woman right there, that represents what honors the Father. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty, but in everything, all she had to live on. And you just have just this beautiful tone of the true heart of the ministry of Jesus. From it, they're going to leave the temple. So in chapter 13, they're going to leave the temple. And because of how grand the temple had become, the disciples are going to be enamored by it. And they're going to look at it and say, what impressive stones. And Jesus is going to say, all of it's going to be torn down. If you'll remember from chapter 11, we talked about the running of the 2 tables, reaching all the way back to the Old Testament priest clearing out the home when there's mildew. And he's going to say, oh, every stone's going to be torn down. And he's going to give a prophecy on Mount of Olives as they leave. He's going to give a prophecy of end times, not only for Israel and not only for them, but still awaiting its fulfillment to this day. And from that, we'll unpack chapter 13. I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope that, as always, you'll take the study further than we have here, and that you'll join us for the next installment of our study of the Gospel of Mark. God bless you. I'll see you soon.